Frank Mason adjusted his $300 JCPenney suit in the cracked rear-view mirror of his Ford F-150, wondering if a lifetime of fixing broken circuits could help him bridge the gap between him and his only son on his wedding day. The late October sun hung low over Naperville, casting long, amber shadows across the gravel lot of the Riverside Country Club. He took a deep breath, the scent of fallen maple leaves mixing with the faint, lingering smell of machine oil that seemed permanently etched into his skin. Beside him, the worn blue ledger sat on the passenger seat, its edges frayed from years of careful record-keeping since Helen passed away. It was more than a book. It was a silent map of every late-night repair and every double shift he had worked to ensure Kyle's future was brighter than his own. "You okay there, Frank?" Mike asked, leaning against the passenger door. His old neighbor looked equally uncomfortable in a rented tuxedo, his hands stained with flecks of white paint, fidgeting with a stiff collar. Frank managed a small, tight smile and nodded, tucking the ledger into the glove box. They stepped out onto manicured lawn, their footsteps sounding heavy and out of place against the soft jazz drifting from the grand hall. As they approached the entrance, the air grew thick with the fragrance of expensive lilies and the sharp, nasal chatter of Chicago's elite. Frank saw Kyle standing near the ivory-draped altar, looking like a stranger in a perfectly tailored tuxedo that cost more than Frank's first truck. Beside him stood Jessica, a vision in $8,000 silk, her laughter ringing out like fine crystal, beautiful, but cold. Frank tried to catch his son's eye, a warm Chicago-style greeting ready on his lips, but Kyle's gaze flickered away the moment he noticed a group of his law firm partners watching. When Frank finally reached the reception line, Mrs. Miller offered a nod so brief it was barely there, her eyes lingering for a second too long on the faint electrical burn scar on Frank's thumb. There was no hug, no welcome to the family, just a polite, distant mask that signaled exactly where he stood. An usher, glancing at a clipboard with a practiced air of indifference, gestured toward the back of the room. "Table 10, sir, near the kitchen doors." Frank walked slowly toward the corner, his callous hand brushing against the silk tablecloths that felt too smooth, too fragile. At table 10, tucked behind a large floral arrangement that obscured the view of the stage, Mike pulled out a chair with a quiet sigh. Frank sat down and adjusted his old Seiko watch, the one Helen had bought him 30 years ago. He looked around the shimmering ballroom, realizing that his son hadn't just built a new life. He had built a wall. As the music begins, Frank looks at the $8,000 silk decorations and realizes that for his son's new family, he isn't the guest of honor. He's a hidden liability. If you are still with us and feel the weight of Frank's silent sacrifice, please leave a 8 in the comments to let me know you're standing here with him. Your support is the current that keeps these stories of heart and heritage alive. If you haven't joined our family yet, I invite you to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss a moment of this journey. Your presence inspires us to keep creating content that speaks to the soul. Now, let's see what happens when the silence finally breaks. Mr. Mason, perhaps you'd be more comfortable if you slipped out after main course. The upcoming professional toast might be a bit dense for someone outside the legal circle, Mrs. Miller whispered, her smile as fixed as a porcelain doll's. She leaned in just close enough for Frank to catch the scent of her expensive lilac perfume, a fragrance that felt like a barrier rather than a welcome. Frank felt the heat rise to his neck, but he simply nodded, his hands resting heavily on the white linen of table 10. He recalled the small scratch on his kitchen table where Kyle once practiced wiring circuits, a reminder of a bond that was now being quietly dismantled by social climbing. That scratch had been a badge of pride for a young boy who wanted to be just like his father, but in this shimmering ballroom, that boy seemed to have vanished. The grand ballroom glowed under massive crystal chandeliers, the light reflecting off thousands of polished surfaces. The sound of clinking glasses felt sharp and unwelcoming to Frank's ears, echoing the hollow feeling in his chest. Mike sat beside him, nursing a beer and looking around with a weary frown. "They're treating us like we're part of the plumbing, Frank," Mike muttered, his voice low and gravelly. Frank didn't answer. He was busy watching Kyle at the head table. His son looked polished, almost unrecognizable, laughing at a joke made by Mr. Peterson, a senior partner who wore a watch that likely cost as much as Frank's shop. During the dinner service, The guests at the surrounding table spoke in a language Frank struggled to follow. Talk of offshore accounts, Ivy League legacies, and Supreme Court precedents. Mike tried to cheer Frank up with a joke about an old neighbor who had accidentally painted his dog green, but a woman at the next table turned and shushed him with a look of pure disdain. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. Then Frank heard it, Jessica's voice carrying over the music as she leaned toward her colleagues, telling them with a dismissive wave that Kyle's father was just a simple tradesman from another world. The main course arrived, a piece of steak so small it looked like an afterthought on the gold-rimmed plate. Frank found the wine tasted bitter, matching the atmosphere that seemed to be curdling around him. Kyle finally approached their table, holding a bottle of expensive red wine. He poured a glass for Frank, his movement stiff and hurried. Just as Kyle was about to speak, Mr. Peterson walked by, pausing to look at Frank's off-the-rack suit. "Is this your fashion consultant, Kyle?" Peterson mocked, his eyes glinting with a cruel amusement. Frank waited, his heart thumping against his ribs, hoping for his son to say something, anything, to defend the man who had raised him. Kyle stood paralyzed for a heartbeat, his face flushing crimson. Then, to Frank's utter horror, Kyle laughed nervously instead of defending his father. He turned away with Peterson, leaving Frank sitting in the shadows of the floral arrangement. Frank stood up to find some air on the terrace, realizing that the son he raised to be decent has traded his backbone for a seat at the miller's table. The moonlight over the artificial lake was beautiful, but the cold look in Jessica's eyes as she cornered Frank on the terrace was sharp enough to cut through the midnight chill. Frank stood near the stone railing, his back to the soft jazz music that now sounded like a mockery of his grief. He leaned against the cold balustrade, watching the dark water ripple below, feeling the heavy silence of a man who had finally seen the truth. Frank felt the vibration of his phone in his pocket. His bank manager, Richard, had sent a confirmation text earlier, a power switch Frank hoped he'd never have to flip. He had spent 30 years wiring houses to withstand storms, but he hadn't prepared for the cold front currently standing in front of him in a white silk dress. Jessica stepped forward, her heels clicking against the stone with a predatory rhythm. "Frank, I think it's time for you to leave," she said, her voice dropping the facade of wedding sweetness. She gestured vaguely toward the grand hall, where her law firm partners were laughing. Jessica told him he is embarrassing her and that his working-class vibe is ruining the image she's built. She spoke of class and status, as if they were things bought at a boutique, completely ignoring the man whose callous hands had built the very foundation she stood upon. Frank calmly mentioned he paid for the very party she's standing in, his voice low and steady like the hum of a well-maintained transformer. The mention of money seemed to snap the last thread of Jessica's composure. Her face flushed under moonlight, and her eyes flashed with territorial anger. She didn't see a father-in-law. She saw a stain on her perfect wedding photo. Jessica snaps, losing her composure entirely, her pride blinding her to the gratitude she owed the man before her. "Do you really think a few checks give you the right to ruin my night?" she hissed, stepping closer until Frank could see the trembling of her jaw. The silence on the terrace became suffocating, broken only by the distant, muffled sound of a toast being made inside. Jessica screams, "Get out! You don't belong here, and you never will." Her voice rang out, sharp as a razor, cutting through the glass doors and into the ballroom. The doors swing open, and 150 guests fall into a dead silence as they witness the outburst, their champagne glasses frozen in midair. Frank doesn't flinch. He simply pulls out his phone and says, "Richard, activate the immediate repayment clause." It's time they saw the true cost of their perfect life. As the ballroom falls into a haunting silence, and Frank prepares to flip the switch on the truth, I have to ask, do you believe Jessica's gone too far? If you are still with us, witnessing this turning point, please comment with a 1 below to let me know you're standing by Frank's side. Your support is the energy that allows us to bring these powerful lessons of dignity and family to light. If you haven't joined our community yet, I encourage you to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss the shocking revelation in the next chapter. Now, let's find out exactly what happens when the lights of truth finally turn on. The hum of the jazz band didn't return. Instead, a heavy, suffocating silence filled the grand hall as Frank's voice, amplified by the speakerphone, cut through the facade of the perfect wedding. Jessica stood frozen, her mouth still half open from her previous scream. As the guests crowded the glass doors, their faces a tapestry of shock and morbid curiosity. Jessica's $8,000 silk dress, which she wore as armor of status, now felt like a leaden weight as the reality of the $425,000 debt came crashing down. Frank held the phone with a hand that had spent 40 years wiring the city of Chicago, steady, callous, and devoid of the tremors that plagued his son. "Frank, are you sure?" Richard Steinberg's voice echoed from the phone, clear and professional, stripping away the illusion of the Millers' independence. "That's over $400,000 in total principal and interest for the educational loans and the wedding venue lease." Frank didn't look at the guests. He looked directly at Kyle, whose face had turned the color of ash. He showed the transfer history on his phone to nearby guests, confirming 37 months of secret support, each line a digital scar of his labor. Jessica tried to claim financial manipulation, her voice cracking with a desperate edge, but Frank calmly pointed out it was her signature on the legal documents, a contract signed in the shadow of the very pride that was now destroying her. The Miller family retreated into the shadows of the floral arrangements as guests began to whisper and record the scene on their phones, the flashes of cameras replacing the warm glow of the chandeliers. Frank officially gives them 30 days to begin repayment, stating that since they are now independent professionals, they no longer need his ignorant help. He adjusted his collar, feeling a strange warmth in his chest, not of revenge, but of the immense relief that comes when a circuit is finally grounded. Frank turns his back on the ballroom and walks toward the exit, hearing the first sound of Jessica's world collapsing, the sound of a law firm partner walking away. The headlines in the Chicago Tribune were as cold as a November wind, the wedding that taught the city a lesson in gratitude. Within 48 hours, the video of the electrician's revenge had swept through the legal circles of Illinois like a wildfire, leaving Jessica's carefully constructed reputation in ashes. Frank sat in his workshop, looking at the blue ledger, the circuit map of his son's life that had finally short-circuited. The smell of copper and machine oil was a comfort now, a reminder of the reality that didn't shift with the whims of high society. Outside, a thick fog rolled in from Lake Michigan, blurring the lines in the neighborhood. But inside the shop, the truth was sharper than ever. The fallout was swift and merciless. Jessica's law firm, sensitive to the public outcry regarding her ethical conduct and character, rescinded her employment offer before she could even walk through the door. Kyle called Frank every morning, his voice a ragged whisper of the confident man he had pretended to be at the country club. He visited the shop on a Tuesday morning, appearing at the door, haggard and humbled, his expensive suit replaced by a worn flannel shirt that looked like it belonged to a younger version of himself. Frank watched him from the workbench, not with anger, but with the weary patience of a father who had seen too many things break. "Dad, I didn't know she said those things. And I didn't know I could be that much of a coward," Kyle stammered, his eyes red from lack of sleep. Frank didn't offer a chair. He simply explained that a burned wire must be scraped clean before it can be reconnected. He told Kyle that respect wasn't something granted by a degree or a title. It was a current that flowed only when the connection was honest. Kyle looked at the rows of tools, the same ones he used to play with as a child, and the weight of his betrayal finally seemed to sink in. Kyle and a humbled Jessica show up at Frank's kitchen table, facing the blue ledger they once ignored. The room was silent, except for the ticking of the wall clock Helen had loved. Jessica's hands trembled as she looked at the meticulously recorded dates and amounts, her pride finally replaced by a crushing realization of the sacrifice that had funded her life. Frank pushes a folder toward them and says, "I don't need an apology. I need you to learn the value of a dollar you actually sweated for." Frank hands him a screwdriver and says, "The debt isn't just money, son. It's time to start paying back with your character." A year later, the autumn sun in Naperville didn't just illuminate the fallen leaves. It shone on a family that had finally learned to stand on its own feet. The backyard of Frank's small house was filled with the warm, smoky scent of burgers on a grill and the rhythmic creak of the old tire swing under the oak tree. It was a stark contrast to the sterile opulence of the Riverside Country Club exactly 12 months ago. Frank stood by the porch, his eyes softened as he watched Kyle and Jessica. They weren't wearing designer labels or chasing the approval of elite law partners today. They were wearing the quiet, sturdy confidence of people who knew the true cost of the roof over their heads. Little Helen, named after the woman who believed in doing without stopping, reached out her tiny hand to grab Frank's rough thumb. Her skin was soft against his calloused palm, a bridge between the weary past and a hopeful future. Jessica, now working at a community legal center, realizes that justice starts in the heart, not just in a law book. She had spent the last year representing people she used to overlook, plumbers, drivers, and single mothers, learning that the most important contract in life are the ones signed with honesty and gratitude. Kyle, too, had changed, his hands now showing the honest stains of hard work, earning back the respect he had once traded for a hollow seat at a rich man's table. The afternoon air was clear of the suffocating pride that had once poisoned their family gatherings. Jessica approached Frank and quietly handed him an envelope, the first honest payment earned from her new job helping low-income families. It wasn't the thousands of dollars Frank had once handed out so freely, but to him, these bills carried a weight that money never could before. Kyle smiled at his father, describing how he tells his daughter stories about her grandfather's lightning hands, ensuring the next generation would never forget where they came from. Frank realizes that the broken circuit has been replaced with something stronger, a bond forged in truth and gratitude. He felt Helen's presence in the rustle of the leaves, a silent approval for the man their son had finally become. The debt of money was being repaid, but more importantly, the debt of character was being settled every single day. As the porch light flickers on, Frank smiles at the sky, knowing that Helen can finally rest easy. Their son has found his way home. Frank's journey reminds us that the strongest bonds are not built with silk or status, but with a steady, humble current of gratitude. Just as a quiet lamp by the window can guide a traveler through the darkest storm, a single act of selfless kindness has the power to light the way home for a lost soul. When we choose to strip away the insulation of pride and judgment, we finally allow the true warmth of family to flow back into our hearts. Please take a moment to reflect on the silent gifts of love and sacrifice in your own life. Perhaps a calloused hand that once held yours or a quiet prayer whispered in your favor. If the story of the Mason family has touched your heart or sparked a memory of your own roots, we invite you to share that warmth with us in the comments below. Your stories and your presence are the light that keeps this community glowing. So please consider subscribing to join our family for more journeys of the heart. In the end, it is not the titles we earn, but the love we return that defines the circuit of a life well lived.